Well, hello and welcome back to my fabulous art channel. My name's KIERON SEAMONS. This is my inky world where we talk about all gorgeous arty stuff. And today we are talking about the secret of the nib. The secret of the nib. Let's find out. Okay, so we have had we as in me and Mr. Miro, of course, we've had about 10,000 different messages about nibs and the secrets behind the nibs. What nibs am I using? What is the technique with this blah, 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 blah. And the basics of it all doesn't really matter. You didn't want to hear that, did you? Right, so here I'll explain a little bit. Now, when I buy my nibs, I'm generally exploring something. I'm exploring a new line. I'm exploring to find a nib that will give me something special. And generally overbuying about 10,000 billion squillion nibs is the fact that they're all very generally made similar. Now, there's a few things. There are some comic nibs out there that are quite flexible. There are some that are flexi nibs with little cuts at the side, which will give you much more bend and such like, which I've probably got a few sitting around somewhere. But basically, that's just a handful of the nibs that are on my table at the moment. You can see some of them are all crusty and need to be cleaned, but it gives you a general idea of how unspecific my nibs are. Any other nibs there? There's another one. There's quite a square one. That's a very rusted up old skinny thing there. But then it's quite... And now if you see some of the technical parts of the end of the nib, if you can get in close enough, then that's quite a thick. And that's a much thinner point. And this one here seems to have like a bit of a ball at the end of it. Same with this one. If I can get in there close, you can kind of see it's got a notch at the end. And that notch will kind of hold a little bit more ink. But a lot of this stuff comes down to, I mean, I buy my nibs like this. I bought a box of nibs, and it's a box of mixed nibs, and somebody has put together a random collection of nibs. And as you can see, some of them are a little chunky end. You can see some that have got very, very pointed end with like a ball at the end. You got some, in fact, that looks like a flexi nib there. There you go, there's a flexi nib. As you can see, that from the sides, you have little cuts at the side, which will give it that extra bit of bend. Then you have something like that. It's almost like a spearhead. But that is also a flex nib, and you can see this cuts out. So I don't buy very many flex nibs for the simple reason that because you have little cuts at the side, it weakens the nib. And if you've got such a heavy hand like mine, quite often that little kink at the side is enough to make the end of the nib go flying past your eyeballs. So yes, if you're a very gentle artist, and you're drawing very gentle, that kind of flexi styled nib there with the little cuts on it, as you can see, that will give you a little bit extra flex. But then something maybe a little harder, maybe something like that, it's got a bit of a bend on it, as you can see, will give you a very direct. And because of that bend, it's pointing down, which gives you more of a tip of the point, which will give you a very thin, fine line. Now it goes on. There's lots of ones. There's another nib there, and it's got like a reservoir at the end. You can see it's got like a little jacket almost. And this dent in the top will also be the same as the ball at the end. It holds a little bit more extra ink if you're very slow and patient. Now the difference is with this, it's got like this extra layer here that you can see it clips on. It can be taken off, if I can, he said. There you go. And I've taken it off. And all that does is it sits on and it becomes a little bit more of a reservoir. It basically gives you that extra little, there it is with its jacket back on. It gives you this kind of little reservoir part here that will hold a little extra ink. And when you're doing your drawing, it'll give you that extra length of use, basically. There are some very, very fine nibs here. I think they're called mapping nibs. There you go. There's another one there. Very long. I mean, look at the difference on the nib. That's a very long nib, and that's a very short nib, but with a rather pointed end. So this is just basically as I buy. I like to buy. In fact, there's a very bizarre one there. I'm not even sure what that would do. It's looks like a little hand. I'm assuming it's some kind of calligraphy nib. And so from generally I find that there's another type of reservoir that it sits on top of the nib. And again, it's just an extra way of kind of having that little bit extra ink being held. But in general, for drawing, a lot of people will use like a fine liner, these kind of micro pens. And it basically is an equivalent of, oh, wrong end. It's basically an equivalent of that, and it will be a very even line, and you'll get them with a lot of illustrators love them because the line is very constant and consistent through, which I don't really generally like to use because I find by the time I've done a few lines it's run out of ink. So I like to have this nib, and I find that the basics of the working of a nib is basically, as you can see through a nib, if I can get it to open, you can see that there's a line down the middle of that, and there's a small hole in the nib. If I put it a bit closer, there is a hole in the nib. And there's the end of the nib is basically two parts. Okay, so it's divided in the middle. And that reservoir there, that hole, as you have it, that kind of hole will hold a little bit extra ink in that reservoir. And if you can imagine that the nib is like two fingers, if the two fingers are closed, basically I'm not putting any pressure on the paper, then the ink will not really come out. It's only when I open those nibs a little bit, then the reservoir that is here will start to let some ink run down through. And the wider I push, the more I push on it, the wider that nib will open. There you go. Let's just see it opening there. Can you see that? And that is basically, let's get it a bit closer. And there you have it. So then it's closed and then it's pushed open. And that's basically what's happening when you're drawing. When you're drawing, that's being pushed apart and you will have a flow of ink. Now, if you're drawing with comics and illustrations that are very even, very thin nib, then I will find that generally most nibs are fine. They're generally all giving you a very fine and thin line. But the discussion here was more about how my style is put down with, and I'm trying to explain that my my way of drawing is quite a heavy approach. I am not trying to get a very thin line. If I can demonstrate, I am, you know, if I wanted to draw a very thin line, then I can draw a very thin line with this nib. It's quite, you know, like I was saying, generally, if I use that nib, or if I take a different nib completely, and I try to do the same type of thing, I can do the same. So what I'm trying to explain here is that, I mean, let's try another nib. Let's go crazy. Here, there's a little kind of flexi nib here, a very, very, very delicate one, almost like a ballerina of the nib world. It is so delicate and so gentle, and you will have pretty much the same approach because I'm not really pushing too hard, and all the lines will basically be similar. You can see that there's 1, 2, 3 different nibs there, and they're all very different in style and look and shape, but they're all taking the same amount of pressure, so that nib is only opening enough to let a very gentle flow of ink. Now, when I am drawing, I like to try to maintain an area of thick and thin. And as I'm trying to explain that, it doesn't really matter about which nib I am using. It's more about the approach of your drawing style. Now, a lot of people are going to argue about this, but as you can see, there are 3 lines there. And this was the first nib that I used. But if I decide that I want to overload my nib and I draw a line, I can have a very thick line. And if I want to splash it, I can splash it. Now that's the same nib, the exact same nib that gave you that lovely, gentle line. The same nib that will give you a very gentle shading or a very gentle cross hashing. So my kind of advice is that, what is your drawing style? If your drawing style is very, very thin, and then buy a couple of nibs, buy a couple of cheap nibs, and see how you feel with them. If they're not doing what you hoped they would do, then maybe you could try and put in a little bit more kind of research into what people online are telling you. But generally, I'm finding that if I want to draw a very even, same nib, okay, so we're not getting confused here. If I want to draw a very, okay, pushed a little bit too hard there. If I wanted to draw a very simple, gentle circle, I can do so. But obviously, if I've put a lot of ink on it, what I will do is I will get a very thick approach. And again, that's pushing harder, saying, give me ink, give me, you know, not this kind of like, okay, just a little bit of ink, thank you very much. It's kind of, I'm pushing down so hard on that nib, that's pushing it wide open. In the same way that if I'm drawing faster, I can get a very nice kind of difference with a thick approach coming down to a thin. So you can see that one side of that is very thick and one side is very thin. And that gives me the control. In the same way that if I want something extremely thick, I might go for a brush just to give me that extra dimension. And my approach is to try to vary the line. Most kind of comic books are quite good at that, but most kind of simple illustrations, kid book illustrations, for example, if you're drawing an animal of some sort, You have a very even line. Let's draw kind of like a mouse. And you have a very even line. And you'll draw like a nose, and you'll draw some little eyes. Maybe you'll give him a nice smile. And what you're finding here is generally it's the same nib. The same nib is controlling that flow of the ink, controlling it, not pushing too much, of just trying to put the same amount of pressure. And the pressure you're putting on that nib is the flow of the ink. So if you're putting a gentle pressure, you will get a very even, thin line. In the same way that you will with a felt pen, like a thin liner. You will have a very thin line. And in the same way that I'm drawing it. And I'll draw the same type of approach. Now, in most cases, when you're looking at someone's illustrations, I could not tell you if that was drawn with a nib or with a felt pen. So, the only difference is that when you're getting into something in like my style of drawing, I would draw the same mouse, but I might be a little bit more thick and thin. I might want to give him, I might even want to give him some hair just to push that style. And I'll give him a nice kind of gentle kind of nose. But maybe the underside I want to feel very heavy. And that is where the style is building. The style might be like, yes, I want a much thicker body to it. Okay, well, let's give him a thicker approach. Let's thicken up that line. Oh, that's beautiful. Right, let's go back to our simplifying the eyes. Maybe I can give him some googly eyes, Okay, well, and you can see how I'm trying to vary my line, especially like when I'm drawing the mouth or something. I'm trying to get that there's a nice thickness at this point and a nice thin. And that overall generally gives a much more dynamic approach to your drawing. And the more that you practice with it, and it will take practice to control your pressure from your hand, about your pushing, and you're easing off and you're pushing down and you're easing off. And that is an approach to drawing. And you can do that with the kind of comics in the same way that you can kind of do a nice thin and then bring it into something, and you can kind of bring it into something that's thicker. And you will find that thin and thick type of approach. And you could do the same type of thing with a brush pen. You can still do the same type of very, 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 very thin, and then down to something thick. So when I'm answering a lot of your questions about what nibs am I using, what blah, 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 all the kind of thing that basically I would love to say, yes, it's this nib. It's called the Supersonic Mr. Miro nib, and you can buy it at such and such for $20 or something. I would say buy a couple of nibs. Go online and buy a couple of nibs and try them out and see what style is coming forward. In the same way that, I also love this kind of scratchy style. I love things that are kind of in that type of, and again, I find that to get that real effect from it is by trying to choose a very fine nib. So now I'll show you the differences between those two nibs before I do them. You can see the size difference for one, and this is I call this my ballerina nib because it looks so gentle and fragile. And basically, if you're drawing with something like that, I can get a very kind of furry kind of scratchy kind of approach. But with the thinner it gets and the more delicate the nib gets, I find generally it's very easy to break the nibs. And you know, as you've seen in a lot of my videos, the nibs go flying past. So the approach here is about trying to find your style. What is your style? What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to get something that's a very thick and thin? Would you be able to be using a brush? If you're using a lot of thick and thin, maybe a brush pen. Would that give you the approach? Why would you use a dip pen if you could use something like that? And you can get a very nice thin and a very nice thick from the same pen. And it's a much easier thing to control in the same way that you can kind of do lots of, you know, varying your line with something that's like that. So again, choosing the tool. I have seen some remarkable, I don't have a thin enough paintbrush, I don't think. But I've seen some remarkable people doing comic books and using a very thin brush. In the same vein as the brush, the kind of brush pen approach. But the thing is that if you're using a brush, a very thin end brush, I don't have a thin end brush really. I'm quite I'm quite disturbingly lazy with my brushes. Look at the state of them. But in the same approach that as you would with the brush, you have a very fine brush, much thinner than that, and you can draw very beautiful thick and thin lines. Lots of great artists online drawing comics that way. But I just wanted to break down some of the very kind of confusing information on the internet. There's a lot of people talking about nibs, and I recommend the G41,000, and I'm not so keen on that. I'm not so keen on singing the praises of any brand. I have a lot of different brands. In fact, there's another packet of nibs there. Is that varied? Okay, well it's not varied, but it gives me a different style of nib. And these were mapping nibs that I bought. A whole, they're tiny little nibs. Look at those. And they're mapping nibs, and they give you an extremely fine and gentle line. For some reason, I bought about 200 of them. Okay. And so I do have lots and lots and lots and lots of different packets of nibs, and sometimes I get very frustrated myself by a drawing that I've done, and I think, wow, you know, couldn't you have drawn that mouse a little bit more wild? Couldn't you have got a nice kind of feeling about his ears? Couldn't you have gone, you know, oh, couldn't you have done? And you know, maybe I can give him some real wild hair, and I just try to get in my own drawing style. I try to really vary the line as much as possible. If I've got another ear, maybe it's a very thick ink approach, in the same way that maybe I want and the eyes again, maybe doing something a bit thicker on the eyes, giving him that approach. And again, maybe just with the mouth, about trying to kind of give him a very kind of wiry type of approach. Again, it just gives that dynamics between the side line and the wiggling mouth sign. And that again gives me such a lovely different approach. The difference between that line is being very, very thin, and that line about being very, very thick and heavy. And by doing that, I mean, the difference between holding your pen also is like holding it like that is going to be an extremely thick. Now just adjusting the angle up a little bit more, kind of like a 30 degrees or something, then you're going to have a slightly thinner than almost flat. That's going to be, if I do that and then I do it almost flat, then you'll see how thick it is. And if I raise it up, it's almost half the size just by changing the angle of your hand. And once you start to get to that type of thing, that kind of angle, what you will do is you'll get whiskers, you know, there's these whiskers. And you have this very wiry type of line that is coming out from the same nib, but changing the angle from that to that to that. And the same type of approach, the same type of thinking. And once you kind of build that into your thinking, build that into your approach of your drawing, you can really have a very masterful, very diverse lined drawing from one nib. So, I hope that has given, there's so many questions to go into, but it's really about varying finding your style first, about what do you want to draw, how do you want to draw, how do you want your drawings to look like? Do you want them to look like a Spider-Man comic with all very like thin and thick lines? Maybe look into some of the artists who have drawn that, and you might find out that they've drawn it with a brush. An old traditional, very thin brush, and they're getting a very beautiful line with that kind of lifting off to give it that really, really fine end. So maybe find some of the artists that you are into. Find into some of their styles. One of the styles that Ralph Steadman does is that he has this kind of like I can't remember the proper name for it, but it is that actually, oh, in fact, look at that. It's an atomizer, a mouth atomizer. There you go. That's what it is. And basically well, let's open it. Let's explain it as I open it. And basically what you are doing is that this is basically moved to an angle like that. And you blow as the ink is there, and you get this sucking up of the ink, and it sprays out into this kind of spray effect. But I found it quite frustrating to use. I found a lot of times it was doing things that I didn't really want it to do. So I never really got into that. But again, it's another way of adding to your style. A lot of times with my drawings, I will use a brush for the simple reason that I love to, like, for example, with that drawing there, maybe I want to have a very thick type of tail added to my mouse. And I will use a brush just to give me that extra dimension, that extra thickness to a line. And across my drawing now, I can see this variation of lines. And for me, personally, I love that. I love to see a very, very different styles of line across. And again, it doesn't matter what nib you are going to use. You will be able to do some cross hatching. I'll do a little bit of cross hatching. In his ear, you can do some very, very, very gentle kind of shading, or you can do it as a cross hatching type style. But again, you don't really need to change a nib. You don't really need to have 2,000 nibs, although I have about 2,000 nibs. But I don't really buy a brand. I don't really search a brand. I did at one point buy a lot of Geo Hughes. Do I have a Geo Hughes nib? Okay, there you are. There you go. That was a Geo Hughes, and it's quite an old, rather caked in ink, and that just shows you again the difference in shape and style. And the reason that I got into those was that they were very generic, with a very good flex. If I can push that, there you go. And that's the nib opening to release. And I felt generally that gave me a very nice stretch. Can you see that? But I bought an old box of them. And generally I found that I just liked them. They weren't helping my style. They were extremely easy to break, and I went through breaking about 5 zillion squillion nibs in the first kind of week. So there is a point of break with nibs also. You can push that flex, but to a point. So I generally did find breaking a lot of nibs. And that is, again, goes for the flexi nibs. Where's the flexi nib? Some of the flexi nibs, because of the little cut, it will give you the extra little bounce. But again, you're still limited, You've got to have enough ink in there to fill that pressure. So you've got a nice flood. So you've got to have a lot of ink on there, but at the same time, you've got to be careful about not pushing that too far. Otherwise, it will snap. But that is a little bit of a rundown, and I hope it is helpful. I hope there's some little bit grains of madness, a few little kind of grainy secrets in there. But generally, don't be so caught up in the kind of technical ways. It's the same, I do think that if you're a good artist and you kind of, how to draw a horse, how to draw a man, I think you can draw with any nib. In the same way that if you are a very good guitarist, it doesn't really matter which guitar you're buying, to a point. Generally, if you can pick up a guitar and you're a good player, you'll make it sound good. Give Jimi Hendrix your neighbor's guitar, and he will still knock out a tune that'll make your ears melt. So practice more on your drawing, get more into your learning and your sketching with your drawing, and don't be afraid to sketch with your nibs. It's a great way of learning. Sketching around on loose bits of paper or in a sketchbook with your nibs, it's a fabulous way to get used to the nib of what you like and what you don't like. And it's a real balance of that, getting to a point where you're comfortable with your drawing, you're comfortable with your drawing style, you're comfortable with your knowledge of your drawing, and you can draw pretty much with anything. This week, I've been drawing with a brush pen. I've been drawing with lots of different nibs. I do try to kind of say, today I'm drawing with this nib. The name of it is, I can't see, I'm terrible with that. But it is trying to kind of give you the confidence that my nib is not better than yours. I don't have $1 million nib, so you can never draw as good as me. It's not like that. It's like, there's a handful of nibs. Which one do you want? Which one do you want to draw? And yes, I am extremely messy with my nibs. And yes, I should clean them a lot more often. And yes, some of them all look rusted and falling apart. But they all generally do the same job. So spend more time controlling your hand about getting that nice thick and thin, and getting those little techniques of drawing whiskers and things like that, about tilting your nib and exploring your nib, drawing it very flat, trying to get a thicker feeling to it, raising the angle, drawing quite thin, and then going right up top and then drawing it with very, very, very thin little hairlines. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful way to explore your nib. So at the end of the day, go away and have some fun. Go and buy a handful of nibs, get a couple of holders, buy yourself a brush pen as well. Why not? Or even if you love the comics, go and buy yourself some really nice fine brushes and just practice. Practice and practice and practice and practice. Sketch and sketch and sketch and draw and draw and draw until you have really started to find your style and find what you want to draw and how you want your drawing to look. But do it in a fun way, okay? Sketch around, see what kind of things make you love. I love a lot of thick and thin lines through my drawings, and that makes me happy. But I don't know what kind of thing you're looking for. So asking also about what kind of nibs. It's also about what kind of nibs do you want. You know, do you want to draw a nice thin and even beautiful drawing, or do you want to do a nice big thick chunky thing? So please go and explore, go and have fun, go and be as venturous as possible. Go and buy a load of nibs and just explore them and see what makes you feel good. Okay, I hope that helps. And if you've got any more questions, don't be shy. Come and talk to me. Come and ask a few questions. All right. I hope you had a fabulous day today, and I hope there was some help in there for you. And I will see you again very, very soon for some more questions. Send me more questions, and I will get in and help you out as much as I can from my little world here. All right. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for listening, and I will see you back here very, very soon for some more wild drawing. See you soon.